kia ora, koto, uma, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome. I am Abby Beatson, the Communications and Engagement Coordinator for NSLA, which stands for National and State Libraries Australasia. I'm joining you today from Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and on behalf of NSLA, I want to pay our respects to the traditional custodians and kaitiaki of the many lands from which we all of us here today live and work. And for those unfamiliar, NSLA is a collaboration between 10 libraries, the national, state, and territory libraries of Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And at NSLA, we bring together the knowledge and the expertise of our staff from across these 10 member libraries to tackle challenges, undertake projects, innovate, find solutions, and of course, provide peer support. And you can find more about the work that we do on our website. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you want more information. And when it comes to tackling challenges and coming up with innovative solutions, AI, artificial intelligence, has certainly got us all thinking. But I do want to emphasize that in this webinar, we certainly don't have all the answers, nor are we presenting a formal NSLA position on AI. But what we are doing in partnership with ALIA, which is the Australian Library and Information Association, is hosting this webinar as part of a series of webinars on AI to support conversations across library and academic sectors. So this webinar is just a tiny part of a much bigger conversation about AI that will continue into 2024 and beyond. And for this webinar, we have three very special guests, which I'm very pleased to introduce. We have Jeremy Rickson, and Jeremy is a principal developer with 30 years experience in the corporate and cultural sectors in Australia, the UK, and United States. And if you're interested, Jeremy has just written for the NSLA website on the large language model that we call ChatGPT. So if you're interested to read that, please head over to our website to have a read. Also joining us is Catherine Bode. Catherine is a professor of literary and textual studies at the Australian National University. And finally, we have Alex Safiroglu, who is a professor of cybernetics at the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University. And she is also a fellow of the ANU Futures Scheme. So thank you to all three of them for joining us today for this webinar. So what can we expect from this webinar today? Well, first of all, we're going to do a little experimental exercise with ChatGPT, which is the large language model called ChatGPT, to get the conversation started. And then Jeremy is very kindly going to give us a brief 5-minute 101 on how ChatGPT works. We're then going to have the presentations from Catherine and Alex, and then move straight from there into the panel session, which will be hosted by NSLA's Executive Director, Barbara Lemon. Now, for everyone in the audience, please take a look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a Q&A button there. Throughout the whole webinar, we invite you to ask any questions that you want to, and you should also be able to upvote the questions that you'd really like to see answered from our panelists. And that session, as I said, will happen at the end of the webinar. And you'll actually notice there are already questions in the Q&A box. And that's because we've uploaded all of the questions submitted during the registration process. So thank you to all of you who contributed those questions in advance. Right, so to kick this off, as I said, this is a bit experimental. I'm going to share my screen and bring up ChatGPT. Here it is. Good. Now, this is live, so I don't know what it's going to say, but I want it to help us kick off the conversation. So I'm going to ask it, when considering AI, what are the top 5 questions for national, state, and territory libraries of Australia and New Zealand? So while our systems have detected unusual activity, I'm just going to refresh that. And let's see if we can do that one more time. If not, it doesn't matter. And I have been blocked from ChatGPT, so that's fine. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm actually going to ask Jeremy to turn on his camera. And even though we don't have an answer from ChatGPT, which is a very funny thing to happen, I can tell you that in its answer that I practiced with previously, it brings up some really important questions that libraries need to ask themselves. And Jeremy, I don't know if you can bring up ChatGPT yourself. That's probably a bit to ask.
Yeah, why not? Let's give it a go.
All right.
I work in IT, so I'm used to things going wrong.
Yeah, no, this is good. And I will message you the question that I want it to.
Cool.
But any issue, we won't do it.
That's interesting. I'm getting some problems as well. I think ChatGPT might be down.
So there we are. Right. Well, let's move on from there. Jeremy, most of the people in the audience have at least tried ChatGPT, and you know you can ask it any questions that you want, and it provides often pretty comprehensible, but not always accurate, and I'll put this question to you, answers. How does it work?
That's a really good question. And probably one of the most important lessons that we've just gotten right now is that when using AI, typically we have to rely on service providers because the computation, the infrastructure and the computers involved are so enormous that you can't, a single organization typically can't afford it. And so you end up with a situation where we rely on something that may or may not be working when we need it. But that's a general IT problem. I should say, yeah, hi to everybody. I'm coming to you from Yuggera land in Queensland. And I'll just share with you, the Yuggera people have a word, yakka, which means hard work. And that's where hard yakka comes from in our English language. So that's an adopted word from the local Indigenous population here in Queensland, near Brisbane. So yeah, how does ChatGPT actually do its thing? So it's at its core, ChatGPT is a language model, and we call it a large language model because it's trained on a lot of English text and other text, primarily English, but OpenAI, who created ChatGPT, really just scoured the internet for all of the text that they could find that was reasonable. They did actually do, well, they say they did, a job of rejecting or removing offensive material or other material that's not appropriate. And later on, I'll talk about what they've done to make sure, or to try to make sure that ChatGPT also doesn't say anything inappropriate. But ultimately, it's a language model. And you can think of a language model as, well, I'll start off with a little experiment. If I were to say, start a sentence and say, Billy had a little question mark, what might be the next word in the sentence? It might be dog, it might be nose, it might be something else. But if I said to you, Mary had a little something,
Lamb.
the next lamb, there you go. Mary had a little lamb. And we know that because we've heard we've heard the nursery rhyme. And the interesting thing about ChatGPT is that the language model that it's based on is not just a general English or other language model. It's also trained on a lot of texts that are common knowledge in the world. And so it starts to have a bit of knowledge as opposed to just being a thing that's capable of producing English sentences or paragraphs. It has knowledge. So it has, and it's often seen questions and answers. If you think about internet forums where people come and ask questions, very often the next bit of text after the question is an answer. And ChatGPT as a language model has learned some information and knowledge that way. So the G in ChatGPT, it stands for generative. So generative language models, really at their core, they're kind of a one-trick pony. They guess, they have a really good guess at what comes next. So in the question, Mary had a little question mark, ChatGPT will know that the next word is lamb. If it's not Mary and somebody else, it'll probably guess something different. And so you can see when you're using ChatGPT that it's generating the text sort of a bit by bit. You can see it, the words coming up. And that's because ChatGPT or other language models typically produce their output a word at a time. So once they've added the word lamb, then it'll feed that sentence back in and go, what might the next thing be? And it's probably a period, full stop, and then it'll have a guess at what the next reasonable first word for a sentence might be or something. And so that's the generative language model, and that's been around. OpenAI have had previous GPT models, language models for a few years now, and they do a pretty good job, but they're not especially accessible to people because you have to be fairly technical to understand how to get them to produce something. All the knowledge is in there, but getting it out is pretty difficult. So what they did was they trained the model to act like a chatbot. They started getting people to ask it a question or prompt it with some text that looks like a question. And then if it gave the answer that looked like an answer, they basically upvoted it. And they paid a bunch of people, about 40 people, and they worked for many, many weeks. So this is a really intensive process. And to basically train a language model to be a chatbot so that it's much more likely to answer questions rather than just continue on from where you left off, which the old language models used to do. And they also, they did something very tricky, which is instead of just using the GPT model and getting some humans to train it, and that's called reinforcement learning, where the humans reinforce the behavior, they give upvotes and downvotes. They actually created a little AI in the middle, and the humans were training an AI, which was training the language model. And this allowed the AI in the middle to train the very large language model much faster. And the humans were doing reinforcement learning on the AI in the middle. So they used a language model to train their language model to be a chatbot, which is really confusing, but it's a really good trick and it works spectacularly well. I don't think anybody realized how spectacularly well it was going to work. So ChatGPT, I'll just let you know what the letters mean, because it's kind of impenetrable what it means. So ChatGPT is a chatbot. So it's based on a language model, which is called a GPT language model, which has been around for a few years now. So G is for generative. That's basically guessing letters, guessing words and letters. Pre-trained, which, as we've just seen, you have to basically, if you're going to have a large language model, you need to pick one that's already been pre-trained. Training a language model takes, well, if you were to buy the computing power necessary, it would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly millions of dollars. It's not feasible. So these days, AI language researchers always use pre-trained models. So that's what the P stands for in ChatGPT. And the T in ChatGPT stands for transformer, which is not really that interesting. But the interesting thing is that Google invented this technology as part of Google Translate in about about 2017, I think. So as part of their AI research work to get Google Translate working, they ran into a problem where it was a scale problem. They were trying to scale up the translation, and they were running into issues just with the sheer amount of computing power needed. And so they came up with this trick called a transformer, which allowed the generative language model to look at the words out of order and to pay attention to certain words. Like if the translator was translating an adjective, for example, the transformer would look back and go, well, I'm only really interested in the nouns in this sentence. I'm going to ignore the verbs. So that narrowed the scope of what the AI needed to do, which made it more efficient. And that trick, that improvement, turns out to be ridiculously useful across all AI models. And so that really started a revolution, and we saw a huge acceleration of the capability of AI models based on this sort of one trick from Google, which they published in a paper. So they're a research department in Google, so they published it, and people were able to see what it looked like and use it in their own work, which OpenAI did as well. And so that here we are. We're in a place where we have a language model that's chatty. It acts like a chatbot, and it's been trained to act like a chatbot. Oh, and there's one very special thing. It's been trained also using human reinforcement.
Yep.
It's been trained to know what its own name is. It doesn't really know its own name. It's been trained to call itself ChatGPT, but it could have been trained to call itself a teapot on Mars. It doesn't really know. It's just a language model. So it can talk about itself in very convincing ways, but it doesn't actually know anything about itself. It's just been trained to talk about itself in that way. And the other thing that it's been trained to do is try not to say things that might be hate speech or anything that's inappropriate. And that was a very important part of the human feedback, where they got 40 people to talk to it for a really long time and upvote and downvote. One of the things that was definitely downvoted was misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. One of the things you'll notice is that sometimes ChatGPT gets things wrong. We call it hallucinating. And that's one of the reasons for that, is that the people who are doing the upvoting and downvoting and to train the ChatGPT didn't necessarily know the correct answer to questions that they were putting in. And so it could get an upvote from these trainers, even though the answer was wrong. And it's a problem from AI. And it's something that is going to continue to be a problem for a while. And it's something that everybody needs to be aware of if you're using AI and ChatGPT and all AI models.
Thank you so much for explaining that. That was really, really useful. I'm going to ask you to turn off your camera now. And now I'm going to load the presentations from both Catherine and Alex. And as they're talking, please keep adding your questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen.
Hello, I'm speaking today from Meanjin, Brisbane, on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and would like to begin by paying my respects to their elders, past and present. So given I'm a literary scholar speaking to an association of librarians, I wanted to spend a bit more time introducing myself than I normally would, to say a bit about what I know, what I don't know, and what in those conditions I might be able to offer the conversation about AI and libraries. So my research focuses on using computational methods to explore literary phenomena and literary methods to explore computational phenomena. In the first case, practically that means I've done a lot of work creating, curating, and investigating literary data sets, including with machine learning methods. So for instance, my To Be Continued database indexes over 50,000 publications of novels, novellas, and short stories in the historical newspapers digitised by the National Library of Australia's Trove database, and it collaborates with the NLA to return those records to Trove. In terms of using literary methods to explore computational phenomena, I'm interested in how we can do things that are associated with computing in ways that are literary or that establish literary correspondences. For instance, I'm working with a data set of hundreds of thousands of social media book reviews of Australian literature, from platforms such as Goodreads and LibraryThing to develop forms of analysis that explore how relating to the literary data can become part of the practice of reading and writing we call criticism. I'm also collaborating with colleagues to design a platform that makes this data available in a way that challenges the division of data and models. As becomes clear working with large data sets, and as I don't think I have to tell any librarians, the computational systems, including the relational databases and the machine learning methods that we employ with data, are not containers or lenses for holding or viewing data, but part of the enactment of database ways of knowing. So I'm interested in how we can make that entanglement not only explicit, but poetic at the same time. So that's a bit about what I mean when I say I'm a computational literary scholar. What I'm not is an expert in either AI or libraries, though I've engaged extensively in both machine learning methods and library materials. I'm very aware that I'm neither a computer scientist or a librarian. So I'm no more able to explain the workings of an adversarial neural network than I am to describe how we should catalogue and preserve a collection. So I hope you'll take what I have to say as coming from a particular disciplinary context that means I, like all of us, know a lot about some things and very little or nothing about other things, including that there might be some things I don't even know enough about to know that I don't know them. With those disclaimers out of the way, here's what I hope can be the take-home message from what I have to say today. It's that libraries and librarians should be more confident in engaging with so-called AI technologies. You should be more confident because, and I'll discuss this in more length shortly, librarians are specialists in many of the things that these emerging systems do especially badly. But confidence is also important for another reason. These systems work with texts and images, but they're also in many ways radical departures from the conditions in which reading and writing have been done. So there's a lot to learn. And when we lack confidence, it can be difficult to learn because we might be inclined to be defensive or anxious or avoidant. I know I often am. But if we're confident as we engage in those systems, we can use that as a basis for sharing what we know, what libraries do well, and how to make things better, and also as a basis for learning how it might be possible to do things differently. So in making that case, I'll begin with two broad limitations as I see it in the current discussion of AI, followed by three questions that I'm going to ask and answer in the typical academic mode that I hope might enable more productive discussion of these technologies. So the three questions are, so you know what's coming, what can libraries teach emerging AI systems? What can libraries learn with AI? And what should an Australasian artificial intelligence be and do? Okay, so problems with the existing discussion of AI. The first is that it's ahistorical. We hear a lot about these new assemblages of data and machine learning algorithms being entirely new and unprecedented and how they're going to change everything. And these developments are certainly remarkable. I would go so far as to say that the subclass of AI technologies we've taken to calling generative AI have the potential to transform what it means to read and write, which also means transforming what it means to think and, to some extent at least, to be human. But discussing these technologies only in terms of novelty as unprecedented obscures the long history of reading and writing and thinking and being human as distributed more than human practices and formations. So rather than discussing intelligence as a property of individuals or machines who might become individuals, as we imagine, I think it's better to understand intelligence as an infrastructural affordance. So if infrastructure is the people, systems, practices, protocols, facilities, and so on that are necessary for the functioning and development of some taken for granted component of a society or organization, then infrastructural affordances are the capabilities and opportunities facilitated by the infrastructure's design and use. Understanding intelligence infrastructurally, we can say that libraries have for centuries been a key component of the infrastructure of intelligence. collecting, curating, calibrating the textual and other medial assemblages through and with which humans think. Recognizing this continuity reinforces the need for approaches to AI that are historically informed, comparative, and above all, I think, multidisciplinary. A second limitation of the current AI discourse is that these technologies tend to be discussed monolithically and separately from the situations in which they're enacted, when, in fact, one of the really interesting and remarkable things about them is the way that they're emergent. So they're realized and repeatedly reformed through encounters of particular data sets, algorithmic operations, and diverse communities and cultures. Whenever we discuss AI, I think we need to say which AI, so which specific technologies, where, for what, when, with what data sets, with what effects, for what communities. Doing otherwise perpetuates the pernicious myth of intelligence as a disembodied view from nowhere, and we all know that myth is used to protect and enable those who have the power to pretend that they come from nowhere in particular. We should, rather than perpetuating that myth, focus on promoting and enabling knowledge systems and practices that take account of history, place, and power, and foreground responsibility and trust. So the three questions I'm going to pose are, I hope, some way of moving towards ways of maybe doing that. So first, what can established intelligence infrastructures, and remember that's libraries, teach emerging AI systems? For infrastructures to afford intelligence requires them to enable meaningful connections across the collections they curate and with the communities that participate in them. In this respect, libraries have extensive experience with the very issues with which emerging AI systems struggle. So some of those issues include ensuring the documentation and provenance of collections, supporting privacy and access, forming and participating in effective national and transnational organisations and systems for standards and regulation, and reorganising and responding to the implications of their collections in discriminatory practices and cultures. So we might say that the substantial and important debate about what are often called the biases or discriminatory effects of AI systems arises from their neglect, or the neglect of these technologies, of the things that libraries do well. Any librarian could tell you that if you simply dump everything into a collection, as happens when you scrape the internet for your training data sets, you're going to end up with a lot of garbage. And there's a computer science acronym, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You can't produce valuable knowledge if you're working with junk. Collections need to be curated, carefully selected, organised, managed, preserved, if they're to contribute to knowledge. So one way for libraries to be more confident with AI is, I think, to conceive of those who are working to develop these technologies as potential students of the practices that go under the banner of library studies. But curation isn't just done with particular collections. It's a process of making connections across collections. So making collections into infrastructure. An example of this I love is FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographical Records. So that's an example of how libraries have collectively and thoughtfully created meaningful shared ontologies, recognizing limitations in traditional bibliographical systems, including what the challenges presented by growth in digital materials. Libraries came together to agree on conventions expressed as a formal ontology that both responded to and helped to constitute the meaning of the materials being used to create knowledge. So if we were going to talk to technology companies, though, one way we might frame this first question, what can libraries teach emerging AI systems, is this way. What professional practices developed in relatively low computation environments would help leverage the potential of emerging AI to be implemented in ways that are more explainable and more trustworthy? So the second question I want to ask is, what can libraries learn within emerging intelligence infrastructures? At present, relationships between libraries, their collections, and their communities are largely mediated by formal, still relatively hierarchical relationships and standard information structures. These have enormous strengths, as I've just discussed with FRBR, but they can also be rigid and predetermine how libraries know their collections and communities and how these collections and communities relate to each other. Because emerging AI systems base their calculations on probabilistic relationships between millions or billions of data points and parameters, the connections, objects, and formations these systems suggest have the potential to enable new perspectives on library collections, including perspectives that respond to the requirements of different communities. So in offering this suggestion, let's put a large warning sticker on it. It's important to recognize that the connections these systems create are not objective. Machine learning doesn't offer a more precise or more expansive view of what's already there. So a recent argument to this point is Wendy Chun's book, Discriminating Data, which explores how common statistical methods in machine learning, such as correlation and linear regression, originated in social ideologies and arguments, including eugenics and segregation. That doesn't mean these systems are racist. So the same methods underpin climate models as underpin social media recommendation systems. But it does mean we need to be alert to their tendency to align past and present and privilege homophily. So the principle of birds of a feather flocking together. And we need to therefore engage with them as ethico-political propositions, is what Chun suggests, rather than determinations of what is and can be. If we accept the contingency of machine learning while remaining attentive to the possibilities of harm, we can approach them not as predictive, but probing, and not as objective, but creative. I've had experience of the possibilities of such ways of knowing with my own work with machine learning and digitized newspaper fiction. So I use machine learning methods such as topic modeling and decision trees, for instance, to define a collection of literary works that I wouldn't otherwise have put together, in which colonial identity was expressed in plots that emphasised the pre-existing connection of Aboriginal characters to country. Such stories contest the prevailing notion of 19th century Australian fiction as an enactment of terra nullius, but as I reflect on that work 6 or so years after I did it, I'm conscious of how relatively closed it was, and I wonder how could it have been improved, challenged, enriched, taken in different directions if it involved more diverse materials, for instance, connecting stories and maps, or more diverse communities, including those from the regions where the stories were set. The best approaches, I think, would emphasize co-design. So rather than libraries becoming a new big brother, data mining their collections and communities, libraries and communities could work together with machine learning to explore new connections. A major thing standing in the way of such possibilities, however, is AI literacy, specifically the lack of literacy among many in the community who might not even be aware that machine learning systems are involved in what they're reading and writing, and that are also reading and writing them. Fostering AI literacy is something that libraries can and should do. A fairly straightforward way is being explicit about how these technologies are already being used to constitute the collections. So the British Library, for instance, has begun using AI labels on some of its materials, alerting users to the role of machine learning in creating the records they're investigating and allowing them to intervene in to improve or alter those transcriptions. Implicitly, this is what Trove already does in presenting the optical character recognition text alongside the digital images of newspapers. But perhaps it would be possible to improve literacy by embedding explanations of how these records were made in the existing text correction process. Some work I've been doing with education researchers and school teachers to create interfaces for staging encounters between library materials and machine learning systems demonstrates that there are some really major obstacles, not only technical but social and professional, standing in the way of building AI literacy. So there's a great deal to do, but such alerts offer a small but practical way of helping readers and writers become more literate with the textual technologies that they're using and that are using them. So the third and final question is, I think, the hardest. What should Australasian intelligence infrastructures be and do? So as I've said, AI is typically discussed in ways that emphasize singularity. What that's meant in the past is that human-like machines will come and destroy or save the world. So the Terminator idea of AI. What it's meant in the past year is ChatGPT. One effect of both forms of singularity is that AI is understood as something that happens outside Australia and is brought into the region, imposed or gifted. And that leaves us with no power, but it also absolves us of the responsibility for participating in this important transformative development in textual technologies. So we need, I think, to consider the challenges and possibilities of building such infrastructure in the historical, cultural, and geopolitical realities of our region. Two vital parts of this conversation are colonisation and linguistic and cultural diversity, which are of course tied together. And these complexities are immense, and I'm not going to try and solve them, but I might just try and pose them in a single moral conundrum, which is this. If Australasian cultural collections are not part of building emerging intelligence infrastructures, then we agree that our textual practices will be formed by the North American and European training data sets and models that currently dominate these systems. And yet, if Australasian cultural collections are part of building emerging intelligence infrastructures, we have to recognise how those collections embody the legacy of colonisation and risk the mistakes of our discriminatory past simply being added to and supplementing or amplifying the biases of an existing global order. Luckily, in asking what's needed for intelligence infrastructures in our region, we have some excellent guides in work being done on Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous protocols for artificial intelligence, and that's in Australasia and internationally. Work on negotiated access to data and on differentially relational rather than adversarial ontologies seem especially promising. So libraries have a vital role to play in this space as well, including because they're used to recognising that questions of knowledge are always bound up in ethical and ontological issues, and they're also used to considering what or whose worldviews are maintained and marginalised in particular systems, and how this might change if things are done differently. So to conclude, I'm going to return finally to the issue we started with confidence. So at present, the most confident voices in the conversation are celebrating the arrival of what Mark Zuckerberg calls the metaverse, and that's the science fiction fantasy of the internet as a single, universal, and immersive virtual world. So this fiction encourages us to endorse a singularity and fake inclusivity that ignores the fact that libraries know well. Not everyone's online, people have different levels of literacy and engagement, but everyone matters. Libraries should be more confident because they already embody a better model than the metaverse, which is what Colombian American anthropologist Arturo Escobar calls the pluriverse. So this concept draws on Indigenous and other relational ontologies to describe the existence of many specific but also interconnected worlds. So libraries are knowledge infrastructures as pluriverse, not a perfect one, but one that recognises it's not perfect and that seeks to forge relations that respond to and seek to be responsible with the particularities of collections, communities, people, and places. Libraries do this while also pursuing interconnection, including in the form of extensive, distributed, reliable infrastructure. So let's make the pluriverse, what libraries already are and do, a starting point for imagining what we might want emerging intelligence infrastructures to be. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this program. I'm joining you today from the land and the airways of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, on land that is always sacred and never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating today. I'm going to share some perspectives on the types of computational capabilities that we gloss as artificial intelligence, or AI, and how these are being used in libraries today, and how we anticipate they will be used moving forward. I'll do so using the types of reasoning and communication that are generative for me, and hopefully for you as well. So before I dive into my argument, I'd like to pause and orient us to where we find ourselves, first listening and then in conversation with me. I am a cybernetician and a systems thinker. I interpret the world as a kaleidoscope of systems that overlap, occasionally interlock, and are ever present and ever in motion. I focus on the dynamics and the motion in the systems rather than the beauty or sometimes the horror of a specific snapshot or a frozen arrangement of fixed elements in my viewfinder. So temporality and processes over time and change in those fixed elements are of particular interest to me. I like to explain that I'm more interested in verbs than in nouns, and that I'm inspired by another cybernetician, Anatole Holt, who in the early 1970s only half joked that he wanted to make bumper stickers that read, "Help stamp out nouns." I'm fascinated by libraries as cybernetic systems and organizations with what I think are particularly interesting orientations to time. My original disciplinary and research training was in cultural anthropology, which you'll see evidenced by how deeply metaphorical and analogical I am in my thinking. Post my PhD, I moved into a career in tech, where I learned to be more kind of T-shaped as I worked in interdisciplinary teams of engineers and computer scientists and designers and strategists and product managers. I leveraged my deep knowledge, kind of the vertical of the T, my deep knowledge in human systems, and grew a deep enough knowledge across other disciplinary traditions to translate and work productively in teams. I moved to Canberra to contribute to building a cybernetics for this century, including training the next generations of thinkers and doers and of cybernetic researchers. In other words, PhDs. And I wanted to create X-shaped researchers. So not good enough to be a T, but wanted to have X-shaped researchers. And by that, I mean researchers with a kind of strong core of thinking and doing in a disciplinary area. Usually their training and careers pre-PhD work, and a desire to reach out in multiple directions and to loop that knowledge back to their core and their way of doing things in order to generate friction in their thinking and to pull in new ideas, and also to be surprised by what they find, which in abductive reasoning is the fuel that powers a research engine. You're always looking for a pattern and something that breaks the pattern in order to break open your thinking. And so here you can see my organization's logo, which is a little bit of an X-shaped orientation. And then finally, we get back to that elephant, or in this case, that octopus in the room, which is, I think, a double-powered 8-armed X or an asterisk. The octopus is my metaphor and my reminder to us to reach in many directions with curiosity, to sweep in ideas and considerations and elements into our kaleidoscopic view of systems as we encounter AI within and beyond library settings. And as we consider how AI capabilities will shape and be shaped by libraries. And I want to think about AI capabilities for and with libraries and how we need to consider agents and agendas and infrastructures and data and processes, some of which may seem really far afield from the hardware and software that we might narrowly define as technology and AI. So you're about to see lots of octopus. The perspectives on AI and libraries that I'm sharing today are drawn from a report the School of Cybernetics produced as part of a research project with the National Library of Australia, titled Custodians and Midwives, the Library of the Future. In particular, I'm going to draw on a series of future vignettes authored by one of the authors, Charlotte Bradley, and in one case by Michaela Jade, based on an analysis of present AI capabilities that are in use in libraries, and also projections into library futures 20 to 40 years from now. And I'll use some of these vignettes to highlight specific AI capabilities and what integrating these into processes and services will mean for libraries. So each vignette has a few components. The first is a remix, a kind of visual collage that you can see here that incorporates some collections items from the National Library. The second component of each vignette is written in the voice of reportage. It's kind of a future factual, in scare quotes, summary of a then future current event. It's not quite the legacy news of the 20th century and not the social media content of the last 20 years, and not quite the hallucinations of a 2023 chatbot, but somewhere in the interstices among these. So for the vignette reader, the reportage straddles the formats of the factual, news, and the friendly, because it assumes you have lots of prior knowledge that these events make sense to you, and the fanciful. There's always a bit of hallucination in them. And the third component of each of these vignettes is written in the voice of reflection, couched as kind of, how did we get to this spot in time in the future? And it presents a future perfect tense speculative history. So as in, we are doing something now that has been going on for a while that logically connects the conditions and events from our present to that future present in the reportage. And that reflection is generally feels a bit scholarly, but also a bit conspiratorial. And it occupies that interstices among future professional researchers and the library patron, the chatter on a future subreddit devoted to conspiracies, and a little bit of just the facts of a Wikipedia entry. So as I briefly touch on each vignette, I'll explain enough of the reportage and the reflections to identify the AI capabilities implicated and the questions that are raised for librarians. So to our first vignette. Our first reportage is a feel-good story about the rediscovery of a supposedly extinct native orchid by an amateur botanist. The botanist was able to find a specimen through clues left in a series of maps, personal correspondence, still images documenting bushfires, and oral histories created and preserved by the National Library. The story is originally presented as made possible by a new type of librarian, a quote, AI that finds information buried in archival documents and brings it to the surface, all puns intended. The narrative is, of course, complicated by the realistic inclusion of coding of collections by librarians and subject matter experts, in particular, the maps that are used to find the extinct orchid. And in the reflection, we find that the story here is really about machine transcription and machine readable collections. Machine transcription is a suite of tools and processes and algorithms that convert multimedia data into machine accessible text, such as video to text, speech to text, and image to text. And these capabilities are critical in an array of applications that can increase content availability, discoverability, and improve search and user experience of library collections. And the questions that we're asking include things like, will well-established capabilities like optical character recognition for typed text also become more reliable for handwriting, either block writing and what people used to do, and some of us still do, cursive writing, and also for extracting text from images such as maps or just photographs, text in photographs. And will capabilities for recognizing objects in images, so being able to look at an image and pull out what's in it, and also in videos create more opportunities for discovery, or will they frankly just kind of overwhelm us, both as library users and as library professionals? And is speech recognition and speech to text just the first step in audio mapping and audio search? So there are other types of sounds that are not language-based that we can begin to identify in recordings and search that way as well. And then also, to what ends will these lead? So for libraries, I think there's a few, and librarian professionals, there are a few questions that we're asking about incorporating machine transcription tech into collection practices. These include, how is meaning impacted with machine transcription? So who's deciding on the labels that are given to collection items, and how do we not keep alive offensive or outdated categories? One of the ways that the story works is that there had been a new mapping of the pastoral maps that led to finding the orchid, but that also involved a lot of human labor and not just automated labor. We also need to think about what are the impacts on time rhythms of work and collections processing and managing that may result, and does machine readability directly correlate with increased accessibility? So just because you can automate some of this stuff doesn't mean that there's not always going to be humans in the loop, as computer scientists like to say. So we can process things more quickly, but if we can't keep up with it, either as collections professionals or as library users, it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to be processed more quickly and or that they're going to be more easily found. We may just have more stuff, but not necessarily good ways of finding it. And my second story, my second vignette, is called Waking Up the Ancestors and Walking with the Dead. And this is a vignette that we wrote in collaboration with Michaela Jade, who is a Darug woman from the Sydney region. Our second vignette in the reportage details a decidedly downbeat future in which the National Library of Australia is called before the Indigenous voice to Parliament for unethical collection practices. Now, the upbeat part of the vignette is, of course, that in this future, the voice to Parliament is well established. In the story, it's come to light that a partially fabricated hologram of a Darug elder has been held by the library for a decade. The original hologram was created in 2022. Remember, this is fictional, by an Indigenous technology developer, in this case, Michaela Jade, in collaboration with Auntie Ellen Holsworthy and other Darug elders, and designed to answer questions about their experiences of the Blacktown Natives Institute. Unfortunately, what happened is that the work was later repurposed by a non-Indigenous developer and augmented with additional training data from the National Library, with this version finding its way into the library's digital archives as part of the National E-Deposit. Its existence only came to light when another non-Indigenous historian found it in the library's collections and wished to include it in an exhibit about the Blacktown Natives Institute. The daughter of the original developer describes the work as colonial voyeurism, breaking cultural law, and representing Darug people without their consent. And the story here is really about the futures of the spatial, as I make sure my build works, the futures of the spatial web, or what Mark Zuckerberg might call the metaverse, of ways of being and interacting with content and creating content real time in different ways than we experience the internet now. But it's also being refracted through important concerns about whose data and what data is used in training large language models, and how materials are repurposed over time, including what protocols we have in place for data creation, data use, data storage, and data management, as well as access and the clear need for data sovereignty and for accounting for materials of national importance and interest. And sometimes those things can feel a little bit at friction. For libraries, we see this as posing critical questions related to the incorporation of protocols of responsibility, not as risk, but as a set of ongoing obligations and relationships among people, and for transparency in the handling and in the development of new content using collections material and AI. The questions that we were asked are, how is and how should access to materials for the generation of new content that's based on library collections be granted and managed over time? How do we increase awareness of potential biases in a tech capability? So how do we know if something is repeating biases of the past that we would like to do away with without realizing that it's happening? And how do we also increase awareness by our publics of how, by whom, and to what ends these capabilities are being deployed? So for my third and final vignette, this one's called Serendipity Engine Accused of Sparking Unplanned Joy. This one is neither upbeat nor downbeat. It's just kind of weird and surprising. In this story, a woman is on her way to a medical appointment and suffers a fit of uncontrollable laughter after being given information from the National Library that was irrelevant to her location or to her task. The exact details of how the audio of a National Press Club Association address was given is left unclear, but the consequences, a kind of spark of joy, a kindling of unpredictable curiosity, leads to concerns about a repeat of a mysterious sounding, quote, stranger hugging phenomenon of 2030. So the story here is about how content may be served to us, how it may anticipate what we might want or need, rather than requiring that we search or request content, data, or information in some way. It builds on the idea of what comes alongside or after large language models that predict the next or most probable word in a sequence, and that is graph neural networks that use graphs as inputs rather than single labels, like words in a large language model. It also draws on the theme and developments in affective computing, or the idea that computational systems will sense and interpret our affective states, so our physical expressions of emotion and cognitive states, sadness or anger or irritation or relaxation or stress, and present content and interactions to suit or adjust our affect. The irony at the end of the story is that the serendipity engine that of serving the right content at the right moment ends up leaving people alarmed at curiosity, or as quipped in the reflection, searching for information is considered an arcane pastime of the very bored or the very old, since everything we need to know is always and already at our fingertips. Moreover, the serendipity engine works too well. It turns out it is allowing more people access to library sources, but it's sending people overall to the same sources over time. And so there's a new need to redo or rethink how do we get more surprise into people's lives. And I think the questions here really are about how with artificial intelligence technologies, we can both personalize to people, but when we personalize so much and we focus so much on productivity and so much on efficiency in our lives, that we lose something. And the things that we're losing, of course, are the joy of abductive reasoning, of looking for the surprise and finding the surprise and learning something new, but also the costs of focusing always on productivity and on efficiency, that we end up in a world where being curious may work against us or be cause for alarm. So, okay, enough with the octopus. I know there have been lots of images of octopuses. And I said a little bit earlier why an octopus has been good to think with. And it was for kind of the obvious reasons that an octopus reaches out in many directions. It has a wide span with all the arms to sweep in ideas and considerations and cautions that may seem far removed from one another. But when we think about it, that's what AI is doing. Or when we think about what we should do with AI, we need to think about many different ways it will impact libraries. But moreover, an octopus is also a fellow being. It has agency. And that agency, many of us have perhaps long underestimated. Recent research suggests that octopus's abilities to learn and reason and remember are far beyond what many of us attributed to cephalopods. They even have so-called mini brains in each arm that allow it to distribute intelligence throughout its body, which sounds quite a bit like some of the computational models that we build today. But they also embody a type of intelligence that we've long underestimated and serve as a reminder for us to both not underestimate the capabilities of AI systems we're building, and also a reminder that such intelligence always functions and exists in a kaleidoscope of contexts and systems. In other words, the AI systems have a lot of capability, but they also require the right context and the right sets of infrastructures and agents and agendas around them. In other words, there is no one AI for libraries, but there will be many AIs that libraries will build and buy and manage and use and decommission over time. And they won't all do the same thing, nor should they. And they won't all function or operate or scale to operate across all functions of the library. And so, yeah, an octopus is good to think with, as anthropologists like to say. And I'll now admit about the power of thinking wide. As we were preparing for this event, we talked a lot about large language models and their descendants and what those will mean for librarians and for communities they support. And I immediately thought about the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. My 2 children attended year 2 of primary school in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest of the US. Sometime around the 3rd month of year 2, they each came home eager to tell me all about the tree octopus and how they were learning about it in school. My older child in particular was adamant that it existed and told me all about how we need to do all we can to help it thrive. And of course, the tree octopus is a lesson, not an animal. It's a lesson by the school librarian in learning to evaluate information sources. And whilst the tree octopus has fooled a generation plus of year 2 primary students in Oregon, it also foreshadows the challenges all librarians will face with communities they support in evaluating the outputs of AI models. And so I thought I'd ask a large language model, in this case, ChatGPT, about the tree octopus, but also about the tree octopus's relationship with librarians. And here's what struck me, and here's what remains stable, even as the capabilities and the dynamics and the features of AI in libraries will continue to unfold. You'll see here that libraries and librarians are the bastions of critical thinking, according to AI. When I queried how librarians use the tree octopus, the answer was more revealing and perhaps more unintentionally recursive than OpenAI may have anticipated. And the answer focuses on the power of librarians and of their institutions. Librarians are reliable, they're organized, they aid with information literacy, they aid with evaluating sources, of distinguishing fact from fiction, and deciding what is a legitimate idea or a legitimate resource. So usefully, I think we can take that comment about the tree octopus as a legitimate resource and easily rework it to apply to the outputs of new AI capabilities. And hence why I said this is perhaps a bit more recursive than OpenAI anticipated. We can generate a statement that, that does define our present moment, a moment in which the power of critical thinking, of abductive reasoning, of thinking not just with pattern, but seeking and questioning moments of surprise seems most important. Yet we're also at a moment when considering the context for legitimacy and for authority and for creativity are also at stake. And that's a lot for librarians to think about. And so I'm going to end on those questions or those provocations, and with a respectfully, that's the word I want, respectfully, middle-aged or 53-year-old, yet surprisingly timely call to action by Heinz von Forster, who was addressing the Libraries Institute at the University of Wisconsin in 1970. And he asked, "I feel you should not wait to see what technology will do with you, or pardon me, as technologists will say, for you, but rather you should tell technologists what you want to be done." Thank you.
Thank you so much to Alex and Catherine for those fantastic presentations. This is a really good time to remind everyone that we are recording these presentations and that they will be loaded onto the NSLA YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and have a re-listen, you will have the opportunity to do so. And just before we move into the panel session with Jeremy, Alex, and Catherine, I have been asked to briefly share the answers from Chat GPT, and I'm going to do this very quickly because we're over time. But you'll be able to see, and this is interesting, there are some very good correlations between the questions asked by the audience and upvoted by the audience and the questions posed that we have here. Very briefly, it's asking how AI can improve accessibility and discovery. It's how AI can be used for digital preservation and archival processes. And really importantly, the ethical considerations. And I've noticed that the most upvoted question that we have is about, how do we deal with these introduced biases or inaccuracies that AI can embody? How can libraries educate the public about AI is another question. And how can libraries ensure future-proofing and adaptability with AI technology. So we're seeing a lot of correlation with the questions from the audience and the questions from ChatGPT. I'm now going to ask our panelists to turn on their videos, and I'm going to hand over to NSLA's Executive Director for the Q&A with our panelists, which is Barbara Lemon. Barbara, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Abby, and to everybody who's been listening, and to Catherine and Alex for absolutely wonderful presentations, some incredibly sophisticated thinking there, and I can see from the chat that it's appreciated. We've got about 20 minutes of power here in this panel to get through a few pertinent questions. We could probably use about 5 times as much time, I think, based on what's in the Q&A. Some brilliant questions in there, so I just want to acknowledge those. I have been through them all. Obviously, we won't be able to answer them all in 20 minutes, but we will provide as much contextual information as possible with the recording of this event when it is sent to all those who've registered. So let's get down to brass tacks in the tiny bit of time that we have left. Jeremy, I'm going to throw to you first. We're thinking about collecting institutions like NSLA libraries that have very large collections, very large catalogues, library management systems that are complex. We're constantly adding to these, or we're making changes within them. It would be helpful if you were able to briefly explain to us how using AI technologies would differ from our current indexing mechanisms when it comes to searching through these systems and finding what we want and changing what we need to. How is it different?
That's a really good question, and there's sort of 2 answers. The main answer is that the way AI works is it's not exact. So if you Google something and you Google the word octopus, Google will go off and find all of the instances of the word octopus. It won't find words that are close to it, or it might suggest words that are close to it, but it won't find them. So, and that's the way Trove works, and that's the way most search engines work. It's an exact match. But AI systems in general don't do that. AI systems, their main advantage is that they're able to deal with subtleties and concepts that are related but slightly different. And so the first thing that institutions will need to do, so one might imagine, for example, a future where Trove, and we keep referencing Trove, where I think we're probably assuming that everybody knows what Trove is, but yeah, okay. You might imagine a future where you could talk to ChatGPT or a chat bot on the Trove website and ask it questions, and Trove can bring up objects from the digital collection or references to catalog that relate to your question in a more natural way and conversational way. And for that to happen, we basically need to re-index everything again in a different way using a different index. So the index wouldn't be straight up dictionary type index. It would be an index that uses, we use the term vector database, and you can think of a vector as just a spot on a map. So if 2 vectors are similar, they're close to each other on the map. And so by asking a question about, octopuses, you might get squid responses as well. I mean, that can be a problem. Maybe you don't want squid responses, and you can say, please don't give me. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's sort of how language models think. They think in these sort of relative terms. I mean, you can play some games with it. Actually, you can literally type into ChatGPT, "What is dinner minus night plus morning?" and it will say breakfast. because it has these points on the map, and you go, well, the dinner is here near meal and nighttime, and you can subtract anyway.
And we're right in thinking that those relational points of information can be drawn potentially from images rather than just text, from from maps, from different sources than we're used to thinking of when we think about search functionality that's text-based.
Absolutely, yeah. There's 2 ways. So there's 2 ways to search images. One is to get an AI to tag the contents of an image, and the other way is just to give an AI an image and say, can you find me other images that are like that, where it's doing the similar vector comparison. Yeah, and the other, just very quickly, I know we're running out of time. The other thing that AI can do that will help indexing and metadata maintenance in general with collections is to go through the current metadata that we have that's a bit unstructured and interpret the structure that's within that field. So, you know, MARC records sometimes have a bit of unstructured data in them, which is just some text that people have written in. And AI can go through that and make sense of it and turn it into a bit more structure, so that later on, when we want to do the search in a very structured way, it can help us, because getting a human to do that is just not feasible.
Yes, I think that's pretty much what we attempted to do with the Contemporary Indigenous Collections audit, and ended up with just masses of spreadsheets with that problem, with relevant information peppered everywhere. So I guess that brings me to throw to perhaps Catherine or Alex. There are a lot of questions in the audience here about how AI technologies can filter out fact from fiction, or if they can. And I guess that makes me think about, building on what Jeremy's just said, a question about how you think AI technologies might come into play in those essential library tasks, like cataloguing, like answering reference inquiries, finding information in this different way. That the fact and fiction differentiation is a tough call. Do you have thoughts about what libraries might look like in future if we were to use AI technologies within those essential tasks? Hypothetically.
Alex? Or I mean, I think that libraries are relied on for reliable information, and the systems, if we're thinking of generative AI systems, then, I mean, it's been observed in the questions that they are not doing factual answers, they're doing probabilistic answers. And so I don't think that they are integratable as such at the moment. I think there needs to be a process of what I would call sort of calibration. So, and that has to happen at even the most minute levels. I was hearing recently of a project being done in Germany where they're reading poetry and trying to get an AI to read the poetry in a way that will be legible to humans, because there's a certain way of breaking at the end of the poem that makes it interpretable. And they have to try a whole range of different formats of speech to get the one that actually allows the voice recognition to be legible as poetry to humans. And so that's just the calibration of one tiny AI technology in relation to one genre, in one language, in one library system. So this sort of idea that we'll go libraries and we'll add AI and they'll just do something for us, I think is not going to happen. But Alex, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I appreciate that you answered the question first, because it gave me a tiny bit more time to think.
Double barrel.
Yeah. So, I mean, these systems, you are right, are based on probability, and they're not necessarily doing the critical thinking for you, or they're not doing the types of critical thinking that may need to be layered on top. And so the challenge I have with all of these conversations is that we speak of these systems as if they are apart from ourselves and that we have to deal with them, but they just kind of have popped up out of nowhere. But all of the data that is being put into those and telling it what to connect with and the probability stuff is coming from us, right? So I had my older kid is at uni, and he does stuff with generation of content using sophisticated software to create images. I'm trying not to name the software company. And he said, oh, you know, it now has AI integrated into it. And I said, oh, that's nice. And he said, anytime you put in the word IT, the most common thing that it will generate is an image of a woman. And he said 60 to 7% of the time it'll do that. And I was like, well, that's very interesting. Why do you think it does that? And so that's the type of critical thinking that I think we need to do about. We can't just say, we have some piece of technology, it works, we're going to use it, but to say, how have we created this thing to begin with? What have we, what is the data that we have used to inform how it will act? And then how do we intervene when we realize it is doing the wrong thing? I have a lot more to say on that, but I'll pause there because I'm sure there's other questions.
We're really squeezing you. I wish we did have more time, but that that makes me think of Catherine's reflections in your presentation about, it's not this sourceless, mysterious phenomenon that's just landed. There absolutely is a source, and you can see why it's in the interests of some actors in the space to want that source to remain mysterious and for it to look like that. Which kind of brings me into the bias and ethics theme, I guess. We've had a lot of discussion recently about the inherent bias in AI technologies, and that has been touched on today due to the limitations of training data primarily, but also about the ethics of using AI generally. Library sector bodies collaborated recently in a submission to the Australian government's discussion on safe and responsible use of AI. I think the link has been included to the chat in the chat somewhere. So I guess, Catherine, thinking about those comments of yours earlier and about what an Australasian AI would look like, which I thought was fascinating, about the pluriverse that we need to create, we have questions from the audience about how libraries might use AI in ways that don't perpetuate the bias already in their collections. I guess my question is that even possible? Not to perpetuate the bias that's already in our collections by using AI?
Well, yeah, in a way, I mean, that's a massive question. What is bias? So I think I think part of the reason the word bias is wrong is because it assumes there is a reality that we have a position in relation to, and then we look at it, and that's an unbiased view, and anything that deviates from this apparently singular reality is bias, and that it's not actually how knowledge works, how collections works, how technology works. So yeah, that is a mountain when it comes to the discussion. But I think in terms of how not to replicate the biases that are already in library collections, which I can see in the question, is firstly, we've got to recognize there's heaps of biases in the actual AI systems as well. It's not only library systems that bring biases, it's the AI systems that bring biases that differ depending on which AI system is being used and what they've been trained on. And one of the things that I think is most important has been mentioned by Alex, and is just what we might call critical AI literacy. So I ran a workshop with teachers that I mentioned in the presentation, and we looked at using one of the things we did was look at a generative AI type model. So it was actually GPT-2, so an early version of the language model that's underpinning ChatGPT when it was open, to be fine-tuned with the 19th century library fiction in the newspapers. And we tried to get the teachers to think about how the biases that exist in the language that the AI was trained on, which is Reddit and all the rest of the garbage that comes off being scraped from the internet, intersects with the biases that come in from the 19th century fiction, which is terrible racism and sexism. And that's what we thought we could have a conversation about. In fact, we realized that there was so little awareness of how language modeling works, how algorithms are intersecting with all the technologies we're engaging with, that we realized we needed to have a much more basic conversation about what is going on here with these technologies. So I think part of the question is getting back to basics, trying to encourage in small steps, people being aware of what they're actually engaging with. So when you're OCRing text, that's AI. AI, it's machine learning. AI is a marketing term to make us believe that machines are intelligent. Machine learning. So just encouraging the literacy that can then start to recognize that there are always implicit ways of perceiving the world and understanding the world that are embedded in our collections and technologies. Sorry.
Beautiful answer. And I'm just thinking of that that workshop as a kind of festival of biases that you had to work through. Alex, were you about to add something there?
No, I just that I agree, and that bias is a very weird word, right? It's really about positionality and having being reflective about and aware of the positionality of yourself and of the systems that you're working in, and accounting for that. right? Rather than trying to do away with it to some view of the system from outside, which Catherine rightly pointed out, you can't have. So, but it also gets back to one thing that I wanted to compliment Catherine on. You talked about the kind of differences between, I think it was like kind of objective use of AI, like AI creating like objectively true things versus creative outputs. And I think it was mapping versus probing, or I don't know what, I think I'd lost the first part of the mapping probing one. But those are really good ways of thinking about what it is that these systems actually do and how we should be thinking about the outputs that they give us. They may be more jumping off points for our own thinking rather than something that we should be relying on to do the thinking for us.
That criticality of understanding the mechanisms that we're working with, and understanding, as you've all pointed out, that we're talking about multiple technologies, not some kind of one magical machine. So that kind of brings me to workforce and skills and roles and the future there, I guess, for libraries, which is also looking at the Q&A, a preoccupation for some. Alex, you and Catherine touched on relevant skills of librarians in your presentations, information literacy, source evaluation, those sorts of skills, organisation. The audience is asking questions like, how do librarians become good prompt engineers? Do you see librarians spending most of their time training AI? And someone has asked, is it naive to think that most librarians would never use AI for anything more than the scaffolding of something they would then build on themselves? So there's lots there, and I'm not expecting you to answer those three questions as they are, but more if you could reflect, perhaps starting with you, Alex, on what new skills or roles you think you would foresee for NSLA libraries and collecting.
I do think the comment about prompt engineering is, I love it, right? Because I just organized a panel for a professional ethnography group, and the same question came up. Like, what is prompt engineering? Like, how do we become good prompt engineers? And someone pointed out that ethnographers are really great prompt engineers because it's called doing an interview with someone and trying to figure out what information that you're trying to elicit without, telling the person what it is that you want to, what you want to know. And I think it's the same thing here, like beginning to understand what the limitations of the systems are, particularly for large language models, is going to be something that librarians already know a lot about because they are already curators of information and are used to thinking in, and I like the way that you put it, Catherine, database thinking, right? So that type of logic and that type of thinking, I think, was pioneered in libraries and by librarians, and is being taken over in computational systems. So I would probably start there.
Catherine, did you want to add anything there? Roles and skills.
That's a great answer. I guess, yeah. I mean, I think that there's a way of prompting these systems that isn't expecting them to answer the question, but to give food for thought. I mean, I think so. There's a form of understanding modes of engagement that is a different way of working with a different type of technology. So you don't Google a question you don't do a Google search in order to prompt modes of thought. You do it to find your directions and you have that sort of engagement with it. But, I think that we can maybe think about prompt engineering wrongly if we think it's about creating the right prompt in order to create the right answer. When I think that we should be using these systems more creatively and sort of imagining, that one of the things they're doing is actually creating multiple pathways, and these pathways get singled down to an answer. We ask it to narrow down the multiple avenues it opens up, but just trying to think more openly, realizing there are multiple avenues. Even when we think there's one single answer coming out, it's never just a singularity.
And there was, I think, a comment in the Q&A sort of warning against that model of the presentation of an answer rather than a series of resources to look into. I was going to touch on kind of first steps. There's a question there for library professionals who've never used AI technologies, but I know Jeremy has shared with us a few useful starting places online, which I'm going to ask my team to pop into the chat. There were 3 websites there, I think, that they have access to. And I think I'm going to wrap us up with a question about the future, which is really open to the audience as well. And I would love for people to throw their thoughts into chat in our remaining minutes, which comes from the audience as well. Thinking to the future, what technology would you like to see created to support the GLAM sector? And I'm going to hit up Jeremy first.
That's an awesome question and very open-ended. But one thing that I'd really like to see is something along the lines of helping people to learn about collections. So if you can imagine going through a gallery or a museum, often you have the audio guide that talks to you through the different pieces of art or whatever you're looking at. What would be really awesome would be to be able to have a conversation with an AI model that's really understands the collection and can talk to you about things that might specifically interest you or gets to know you over a period of time, and can say, do you remember how you really liked that painting? Well, this one is related to that in such a way or something, and something that can really draw people in a way that you'd love to have a personal guide every time you went to one of these things. So it's something to bridge that gap. And the caveats, of course, with everything we've talked about. We don't want an extremely right-wing AI to start bringing you to statues of Wagner or whatever.
a politicized AI. Thanks, and some great suggestions coming in the chat. Catherine, did you have any thoughts there? No pressure.
I've got a couple of thoughts. One of them is just a sort of general comment that, we already have a lot of collections that are licensed in ways in Australia, at least, I'm not sure about New Zealand, that are not open to derivative use by researchers, and that sort of limit the way we can engage with collections anyway. So I think that there's a conversation that needs to be had about the way that we negotiate access to materials that are being brought in and made available. But in terms of future technologies, I think there's a risk if we think of ideas that we can just perpetuate modes of engaging with collections that already exist. And I think that taking a sort of an approach that's been called design justice is a useful way of avoiding that. So design justice is this notion that you collaborate with communities that are also co-designers in the creation of technologies, and you don't assume you're coming with an answer, but you come to elicit understandings of how people are already designing for these technologies, to understand how you can design with them. So rather than thinking of ideas, because I'm sure I will just impose the types of ways I have already of thinking things, just trying to think about how we can stage those conversations, I think is really important as we deal with new technology.
Now we can arrive at those ideas in a different way. Thanks, Catherine. And Alex, to finish with you.
This is really easy because I do not want another technology. I think that what I want is a different world. And I want a world in which we don't immediately go to a tech solutionism and say what we could do. What we need is like a new way to access library content, or a new way to, the example that I always give is autonomous vehicles. So I used to do quite a bit of research in that space. And I'd hear the argument over and over again about, like, if we had autonomous vehicles everywhere, all our elders would be able to get around and go to doctor's appointments and do everything they want to do without having to have adult children around to drive them. And I go, okay, what problem are you actually solving there? And the problem is more about intergenerational care. The problem is more about social connection. The causes of that problem aren't the fact that we have cars. It is the fact that we have done urban planning in such a way, and housing in such a way, and co-housing in such a way that it makes it necessary to live in a particular way and have cars. And so when I hear people say, we need self-driving cars because it'll help the elderly and there'll be so fewer accidents because all accidents are caused by, or crashes are caused by humans, I think, yes, that's because all humans are driving cars. And once the systems start driving cars, there'll be different types of accidents. So I just want a world in which we think a little bit more about what it is that we think we're going to get out of technology, and think a little bit broader with those kind of octopus tentacles about what problems are we actually solving before we go to the tech solution.
Amen to that. I think that's a perfect wrap up to our session today. Enormous thanks to you, Professor Alex Viriglu, Professor Catherine Bode, and Mr. Jeremy Rickson. We're so grateful to you for your time. Everybody online, stay tuned for a recording. And as I say, we'll drop in as many sort of written responses as we can with that. Appreciate your time very much indeed. Thank you.